Well, it looks like everybody's favorite government agency, the Internal Revenue Service, is getting a twin, the External Revenue Service. So Trump recently announced that on his first day in office, he would create a new government agency that would be responsible for collecting tariffs. Here's what he had to say. For far too long, we've relied on taxing our great people using the Internal Revenue Service. Through soft and pathetically weak trade agreements, the American economy has delivered growth and prosperity to the world while taxing ourselves. It is time for that to change. I am today announcing that I will create the External Revenue Service to collect our tariffs, duties, and all revenue that come from foreign sources. We will begin charging those that make money off us with trade, and they will start paying finally their fair share. January 20, 2025 will be the birth date of the External Revenue Service. Make America great again. Now, he said January 20th, but I do believe creating a new agency requires congressional approval, so we'll see what happens with that. Currently, collecting tariffs is the responsibility of Customs and Border Protection, which is housed within the Department of Homeland Security. So this job exists. The creation of this agency would essentially be moving it from one agency into a newly created one. But I do want to talk about how tariffs work and who actually pays them. Let's just start with the basics. A tariff is a tax imposed on imported goods, and it's usually a percentage of the goods value or a flat rate per unit. So for example, if a $100 product is imported from China and that's subject to a 10% tariff, that would be $10, and that is paid to the US government. But who actually pays that? So this is where things get a little interesting because the answer is not as simple as the foreign country. And there's really two aspects to look at with this. Who bears the legal burden to pay it, like who physically makes the payment, and then who bears the economic burden of paying it. So the legal obligation to pay the tariff actually falls on the US company importing the goods. So ironically, the External Revenue Service would be collecting tariffs from US companies importing goods from other countries. So if the US were to place a 10% tariff on China, China doesn't pay that. US companies will pay it legally. Apple will pay it, Microsoft, any US company importing goods from China. Now, who pays the economic price is a different story. So let's take a scenario where Apple is importing a $100 product from China subject to a 10% tariff. So the first potential outcome, Apple says, okay, well, now that we have to pay this 10% tariff for importing, we're not going to pay that $100. If you want us to keep buying from you, you're going to need to lower the price. So out of fear of losing a portion of the US market share, China lowers their price to $90, $91, which keeps the cost the same for Apple, a $90, $91 product with a 10% tariff. But it reduces the profit margin for the Chinese company. So in that scenario, China bears the economic burden of the tariff so that they can continue selling to the US, meaning you as a consumer experience no price increase. The US government collects some tariff revenue, great. But the downside being that there was no increase in domestic production since the product is still being imported. Now, this scenario assumes that exporters are willing to absorb those losses, which many exporters are unable or unwilling to do so, particularly in industries or with goods where there are very slim profit margins. So as a result, exporters may try to cut costs like with labor or material quality. So that's potential outcome number one. The second potential outcome, the exporter, China in this example, doesn't lower the price and the cost to the importer, Apple, increases by 10%, the cost of the tariff. So now Apple has to pay $110 for what they previously paid $100 for. $100 goes to China and then $10 goes to the US government for the tariff. Well, when Apple's cost goes up, in order to maintain profit margins, they will raise prices to cover the cost of the tariff, which means you pay more for your iPhone or really any product that the import was used to create. So that's a potential outcome. Third potential outcome, let's say Apple decides to eat the cost of the tariff out of the goodness of their heart. So cost went up, but they decide to keep the price the same because they love their customers so much, or realistically, they don't want to lose market share. So that would mean lower profits for Apple. And so you may think, well, okay, who cares? It's Apple, they can afford it. Fair, but who does care is investors. So people who invest in Apple stock, which most likely includes your 401k and your IRA, since Apple represents a good chunk of a lot of US stock funds. That means less dividends, less reinvesting in new products, lower growth expectations, which means lower stock growth. So there's an economic cost there that everybody kind of bears to some extent, even if indirectly. And then finally, the fourth potential outcome is the importer, Apple, switches to domestic alternatives. So rather than trying to pay China and the tariff, they decide to pay a US company for the product, or they develop their own manufacturing here, which would be more expensive in the short term, at least, because we have higher wage standards, we have better working conditions. So that means, again, higher cost for you. So now that product may cost Apple $120 instead of the original $100, which again would potentially lead to more expensive iPhones. But the benefit to that being there's a boost to domestic industries, more jobs here, perhaps spurred economic growth here in the US. That just takes time to build up, and that comes at the cost of higher prices in the short term, at least. And that's a trade-off that some people are willing to pay. Some people are not. Some people can't afford to make that trade-off. But no matter what, somebody pays the tariff in some form. And it's not always just the foreign exporter. They're a complex economic tool, much more complex than I went through here, with winners and losers. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this in the comments below. Hope this was informative. Thanks for watching.